start, I wanted to show you a couple of things on our website. So this is our home page, which is watershedcouncil.org. And if you go to Hot Topics and just click on Climate Change, there's our climate change page. And right off here to the right, Resources, is the publication that we just did for local governments. And you can download it here. You can click the link and either just read it on the page, or it gives you an option to download and save it as well. So I just thought you'd want to see that on our website. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming today. This is our final in our series of icebreakers for the winter. The Watershed Council is celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, as we were established in 1979. We are membership based. We have over 2,000 members, and more are always welcome. And if you're not familiar with us, we work locally in watersheds of Antrim, Charlevoix, Sheboygan, and Emmett counties, and we also do statewide and Great Lakes Basin-wide work. Hi, come on in.
Thank you.
Yeah, just help yourself. Whoops. Here's our agenda for today. So we're going to review some climate change basics. We're going to talk about a recent publication that we did. We will highlight local impacts of climate change, and then we'll talk about what local governments can do to adapt and become more resilient. So based on NOAA data, and NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the 2017 average global temperature across land and ocean surface areas was 1.51 degrees Fahrenheit above the 20th century average, making it the third warmest year on record behind 2016 and 2015. It was also the warmest non-El Nino year on record. And global warming is not climate change, but it is the key driver behind climate change. As the greenhouse effect warms the planet, the result is climate change, which means different impacts to different locations. These numbers represent an enormous amount of energy across the planet. So this is a representation of the year 2016, which again was the warmest global year on record so far. To fully appreciate the complexity of the system, it's important to note that the Earth's surface heats unevenly. That's what causes air movement and weather in general. Climate change amplifies this, and we see varying impacts in different locations. And this is one result. Here you see the hottest years on record. I've already mentioned it was 2016, followed by 15, 17, and last year was the fourth on record.
Okay, thanks.
So the last 5 years have been the 5 warmest. And it's not just the air that's heating up either. The fingerprints of climate change can be found throughout the climate system, including in the oceans, which are absorbing a vast amount of extra heat. This is the only reason we're not seeing more direct impacts on land yet, and I really want you to think about this. The ocean is absorbing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, and the bad news is that's making the oceans more acidic. So the greenhouse effect is caused by adding carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to our atmosphere. The increased emissions of greenhouse gases is what the scientific community agrees is making the major difference in our climate. The level of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere is the highest it has been in all of human history. These pictures are from Miami and show residents and visitors dealing with a new phenomenon called sunny day flooding. In the Florida Keys, where I grew up, the residents are facing a question. How much water are we willing to live with? The county adopted a new standard across the Keys. Roads should be elevated enough so that they would flood on average no more than 7 days a year. That meant that the roads in Key Largo, for example, had to be raised 6 inches. As climate change gets worse, a local official noted, quote, There may be sections of road that have to go under. Local governments around the coastal U.S. will face variations on that dilemma, perhaps sooner than they realize. Which leads us to our publication. It's called Resiliency Plan for Governments in the Little Traverse Bay Watershed, Local Climate Solutions. And as you can see, it was generously funded by the Petoskey Harbor Springs Area Community Foundation. And I showed you that you can find this on our website. On May 11th of 2018, Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council hosted a climate change summit for local governments funded by the Community Foundation. The purpose of the summit was to inform natural resource managers and local officials about expected impacts from our changing climate and help local governments make our coastal cities more resilient to these changes. The publication was created as a follow-up to the summit, and I showed it to you online, and here it is in hard copy. And we have distributed hard copies of this to the county and also to the city of Petoskey, but we're hanging on. We only had so many, grant funds, so we're holding on. We're going to be distributing them. I'm going to be going out to various townships in the Little Traverse Bay watershed this spring. And when we're finished with that, if we have any left over in the hard copy, then we can get them to you. But again, it's very convenient for you online. The summit, the agenda for the Climate Change Summit is actually here on the back page of the publication as well. And I forgot to show you, but on the website, if you go to News and Resources and Videos, you'll see that the Climate Change Summit was also videoed, so you can get all of the presentations online as well if you're interested in that. So we talked about NOAA earlier, and NOAA says that coastal resilience means building the ability of a community to bounce back after hazardous events such as hurricanes, coastal storms, and flooding, rather than simply reacting to those impacts. So this slide shows the NOAA 5 Steps to Resiliency, and our document is built around this concept. So now we're going to look at local impacts. So here I have some scenes from across northern Michigan that many of you will relate to or recognize. Northern Michigan is blessed with abundant natural resources. What kind of climate are we used to that provides us with these benefits? Let's look at some examples from the publication. For starters, spring runoff can be epic if winter has been snowy, and I think we're seeing that this year. I was just telling Mark earlier that I spoke to the Road Commission. Tammy and I spoke to the Road Commission last week, and they were explaining that we're kind of lucky because it's slowly melting. We're not getting a quick, 60-degree several days where we could flood in certain areas. We've got some vulnerable areas that we're concerned about. So spring runoff is a big deal. Cold blue ribbon trout streams beckon across the landscape, providing habitat that fosters some of the best fishing in the world. And as we move through this presentation, I want you to think about those cold water streams, which make so much of the quality of life that we have up here. Because when you get flooding, for example, and we're going to talk about that more, but when you have flooding where the water can't be absorbed into the landscape, it stays on the impervious surfaces and it warms up. Okay, and it gets warmer when it ultimately enters the rivers or the lakes that it's eventually draining to, which is thermal pollution, because we need those cold streams for so much of the ecosystem requirements for some of the wildlife and the plants and animals that live around us. So those cold streams are important, and changing the temperature of those streams would really make a difference to our way of life. Average annual rainfall here is just over 30 inches. The growing season is about 160 days, favoring fruits and vegetables, including grapes for regional wineries. Annually, air temperatures in the region average 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Although summer can be hot, we normally average only 5 days exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit annually. And importantly, Our summer nights cool down to pleasant ranges, with average temperatures ranging from 75 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit in the hours of 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. And this is important in times of severe heat because that cool down gives animals and plants and certainly human beings the ability to recharge and recuperate from extreme heat during the day. So more pictures that you will probably be able to relate to, and asking the question, why do people like it here and will they always like it here? Winter weather is something residents of Little Traverse Bay Watershed are accustomed to, with an average annual snowfall of 103 inches. But I was talking to someone earlier this week and they were telling me they've already had 145 inches north of the watershed here of Little Traverse Bay, so we've had quite the winter. We have trails for snowshoeing and cross-country skiing, in addition to scenic frozen inland lakes dotted with ice fishermen. Blizzards are rare, but they can be fierce, and we expect rough winter weather in this part of the world with an average annual extreme snowfall of usually 37 inches. And on average, we have 71 days with a maximum temperature below freezing, 71 days, as opposed to only 5 days over 90 degrees. So we live in a very temperate, moderate area. All of this is what we are used to in the watershed, but things are changing. While we are far removed from the melting glaciers in Greenland, and we are not a sinking Pacific island, climate change is still something we can see in our local setting. We will look at local impacts and also strategies for local governments to adapt to those changes and be resilient. And before I move on to some of these examples, I want to tell you about one of the things that was featured at the Climate Change Summit, which was something called an integrated assessment, which was research done by Michigan State University. And what they looked at was climate change in the Grand Traverse Bay watershed, which they defined as ranging from Manistee to Sheboygan. Okay, and they ran climate models for this integrated assessment about our local area, and we featured those at the summit, and some of this information that I'm going to be giving you is from those local climate models. So first we're going to look at the Great Lakes region, okay, not just northern Michigan, but the Great Lakes region as a whole. We're already seeing changes, and these numbers capture about the last 60 years, from basically the 50s to the early 2000s. So you can see that annual ice coverage declined 72%. Average air temperatures increased over 2 degrees, which is higher than the global average. The amount of precipitation falling in the heaviest 1% of storms increased by 37% throughout the Midwest. The number of days with land snow cover has decreased since 1975 by 15 days, and the average snow depth decreased by 2 inches. And then we have the frost-free season, which has already lengthened by 9 days in the Midwest. So you can see that we are seeing things at the Great Lakes region scale. But in Northwest Lower Mission, and these numbers are from the integrated assessment that I was talking about, precipitation has increased across our region. And Traverse City and Petoskey are seeing more than an extra inch of rain a year on average for the last 10 years. Heavy rain events are increasing in volume, so we are basically getting wetter. We also have seen air temperatures increase as the region gets warmer, and the higher elevations are seeing the biggest increases, where you can see here some areas near Lake Michigan have seen cooling or no increase in air temperatures, but generally northern Michigan has warmed, and we are also getting, in addition to getting wetter, we're getting warmer. So this slide shows the warming I just mentioned. Note that we're in the plus 2.5 to 3 degrees warmer over the last century. And there will be impacts to our snow. We're going to have less non-lake effect, but a greater occurrence of lake effect. And I believe we already saw that with our storms this winter. This picture scares a lot of people. This shows our climatic location in terms of current climate and what our local climate will look like in the future. And you have two scenarios here, the high emission scenario in red and the lower emissions in the orange. So if we're successful at curbing emissions, by the end of the century, we may have a climate that resembles southern Missouri or northern Arkansas. If we're not successful, we may end up at the end of the century with a climate similar to Oklahoma or Texas. So, what can local governments do to adapt and become resilient? So, our publication follows the following problems locally. So, we have 4 things that we focused on: variable temperature patterns and extreme heat, severe storm and flooding events, something called coastal dynamics, which we'll talk about, and infrastructure impacts. So the first set of problems, variable temperature patterns and extreme heat. As noted earlier, one thing that shapes our culture and way of life is winter weather. Another is the fact that our pleasant summers provide an escape from hotter areas downstate and in other areas of the nation and the world. Unfortunately, one element of global climate change is rising temperatures. And for us, this will mean an increased frequency and length of severe heat events, an extended growing season, meaning an earlier spring and a later fall. We'll have increased risk of drought and wildfire, particularly in the summertime, and reduced ice cover on the Great Lakes. So we looked at solutions for this, and some of the things we're telling local governments to do are to plant trees. And each of these has a longer explanation in the publication. We're saying think about narrower streets and landscaping them with native vegetation, install green roofs on public buildings, pave with permeable materials, and all of these things are meant to prevent what they call the creation of heat islands in an urban landscape. So by taking some of these more conscientious steps, you might be able to reduce some of the heating effect that we see in cities. Additionally, this is the logo for our Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, meaning CISMA, that's what that stands for. And we have Charlevoix Antrim Kalkaska Emmet. So that's the Cake CISMA, and they work with invasive species. And we know that climate change is going to invite new species to our area that will feel comfortable here that they didn't feel comfortable in other climates. So we want to make sure that local governments stay close to working with Cake CISMA and work in partnership to manage forest lands and provide cooling centers. And one thing that I provided in this publication was an example of a heat flyer done by the Department of Community Health. And it's an excellent flyer that we think that local governments ought to use. No need to reinvent the wheel here, but it basically talks about exactly what you can do to protect yourself from extreme heat and who needs special care and what is heat illness. And it talks about heat exhaustion and cramps and stroke and where to find more information. So this is pretty important. And I just wanted to read one section to you about working in partnership to manage forest lands, just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about here. So the Little Traverse Bay watershed is surrounded by abundant woodlands and forests. These lands are in both public and private ownership. Regardless of ownership, forests are vulnerable to climate change and drought. Enhanced droughts increase the risk of forest fires. The summer of 2018 demonstrated this in tragic ways, as forest fires ravaged several states across the U.S., exacerbated by climate-driven conditions. Michigan is not immune to this threat. We should expect more short-term droughts, which make our forests vulnerable to pest and fire. So 3 things that we ask the local governments to consider. Forests in the region are owned by federal, state, local, tribal, and private entities. We want you to strengthen partnerships with the local Office of Emergency Management and those who own and manage forest lands, and engage in conversations about how local government can help keep forests healthy. We would like them to form coalitions with the local Office of Emergency Management, forest owners, and land conservancies, and practice response scenarios and identify how the coalition can be proactive. We want them to work together to be prepared for changes that have the potential to influence the entire region if something goes wrong. Pool resources and do public outreach and education about preventing pest infestations or increasing awareness of fires during drought conditions. Invasive species or fires can also start in homes and spread to forested areas, in addition to things starting in the forest and spreading to homes. So everyone really needs to be aware of the dangers and learn about how to prevent disasters. So this gives you a flavor of some of the actual practical things that we're talking about when we produce. Every time I have a solution come across here, there's a paragraph connected to it explaining why, it's important. So next we have severe storms and flooding events. These will be a challenge for thousands of shoreline property owners on both the Great Lakes and on inland lakes and streams. The Great Lakes are currently at high levels, swinging in just a few years from very low levels, as I'm sure you'll remember. Future swings are expected. Several inland lakes and streams are at high water levels. Floodplains are changing in relation to boundaries and frequency of floods. And as a result, we're likely to experience more frequent and severe storms, increased winter and spring precipitation, less precipitation as snow and more as rain, and more flooding events with risk of erosion. And on this floodplain, some of you may be familiar with the conversation happening in Harbor Springs right now. There's a new FEMA map being proposed, and it would capture about another 100 properties and put them into the floodplain. And so there's a whole conversation going on in that community about ways to alleviate the potential for new flooding and how to handle that. It's a difficult conversation, but one that is ongoing with the community. So for solutions for this, we ask them to either develop a flood response plan or revisit it, protect against high winds and severe storms using things like trees and bushes, as screening, use rain barrels, swells, and rain gardens to capture stormwater and help spread it out. Also revise as needed any required waterfront setback requirements in the area. Encourage replacement of hardened shorelines, restore public wetlands and encourage restoration on private lands, and we'll talk more about this in a second, and use the planning process to reduce impervious surfaces. So next we have coastal dynamics, and since records began, Lake Michigan's water level has fallen by as much as 4 feet in as little as 2 years. In the future, climate change may cause even greater extremes for water levels in the Great Lakes. We think coastal dynamics is an accurate title and description for a chapter about what our regional coastal communities are facing. Dynamic water level conditions that have always included natural fluctuations and will likely be exacerbated by our changing climate. So this likely means warmer water temperatures, greater extremes in Great Lakes water levels that may impact recreation and shipping lanes, and reduced ice cover on the Great Lakes. So some of the solutions are to revise again required waterfront setbacks, evaluate both boat launches. This one's important. This is the one where I was talking about wetlands earlier. To work with private landowners to maintain open space for ecosystem migration with changing water levels. Less hard shorelines, lots of shoreline wetlands that absorb the impacts from coastal storms and accept the water easily. You don't want these coastal storms coming into cement, cement, which is basically, the area paved over. And again, we're urging them to work with Cape SISMA on invasive species issues. And then finally, we've got infrastructure impacts. All of the categories noted require local governments to understand their built environment in order to assess resiliency to changing weather patterns. Extreme heat, severe storms, and increased flooding are going to impact basic infrastructure like roads and buildings. Infrastructure will be vulnerable unless local governments confront these problems and work to become resilient, including stormwater and sewer systems, septic systems, transportation infrastructure, and harbor infrastructure, all really key to this area's quality of life. So some of the solutions there are promoting water conservation, because this area is going to continue to grow. So increased population and increased air temperatures are going to put increased demands on water. And I know that we are not used to conserving water in this area. We are very, very spoiled. But, you know, we came across this in the Great Lakes Compact, where we were trying to get people to understand that conservation had to be a part of the compact, because you can't tell people in other areas of the world, you can't have your water, we're busy using it, while we're wasting it in our own backyard. You just can't do that. So water conservation does need to become part of our vocabulary here. Some other solutions: minimize leaks in infrastructure, the sewers and that type of thing. Provide septic system oversight, which is woefully inadequate in the state of Michigan. You may or may not know that. It's in good shape when you want to install a new septic system. There are about 40 local health departments throughout the state, and they're mostly in charge of multiple communities, and they all have local sanitary codes. And these codes are very good when it comes to looking at siting and designing and installing and constructing new septic systems. That's fine. The problem comes because in Michigan, in the state of Michigan, and it's the only state in the nation that never requires you to look at that septic system again once it's installed. So we're working hard at the local level to get local ordinances in place that require at least inspection of septic systems when they're sold as part of the buying and selling. Let's see, what other solutions here? Map vulnerable locations. This is helpful to, for local governments to look at their area in a new unit at a time and think about mapping, in terms of climate change, what could be vulnerable and what should we prioritize to think about making stronger and more resilient against climate change. We also like them to plan for flooding impacts on infrastructure. Take a look at harbor access and floating docks. All of these are solutions that might be important for local governments. And finally, here's a picture of Greta Thunberg from Sweden. She's my favorite climate activist. She recently spoke at the Davos World Economic Forum, and this is a quote. "Adults keep saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope, but I don't want your hope. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act." So that's what we've got, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
When was this thing you presented last year? What month or date was that?
May 11th it was.
Okay, I'm wondering why I didn't come. Must have been out of town or something.
Yes.
One slide that you put up showed us warming, but it showed the southern states cooling. Yeah. Is that
Yeah.
seems like they should get warmer also.
Yeah, it does seem like that, but there are different geographic features that impact those other areas, and I can't speak to them because I'm not familiar with the models. But we're seeing things in the models that we ran that are definitely related to our closeness to the Great Lakes, to having a Great Lake right in our backyard. And so, yes, and I think I made the point early on that we were going to see varying impacts in different locations. So,
is this program going to address global issues or just the local area?
No, I believe it's global, right? Yeah, this is gonna be
So this is gonna be a more extensive
yeah.
of what you've just gone through.
Yeah, my point today was to focus on our local government publication and explain what's available, and actually to ask for you to help us urge your local governments to get a copy of this in their hands and read it, you know, and we'd like you to read it online as well and push your local government to do some of the things that you think that they could do that, you know, it's not gonna happen overnight. All of these solutions aren't going to be implemented in 1 week or 1 month or even 1 year. But your pressure to your local governments, if you see something that rings true in here and makes sense to you, you can always contact your local government entity and your county representatives and tell them, hey, you know, take a look at this. There's information that we'd like to see you use.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
I have property out Sheboygan County, 40 acres, and I just had them I'm doing timber management.
Mm-hmm.
So they've just gone in and taken trees out, thinned them out, done all that kind of stuff. But they will be leaving the tops, as they call them, you know, the branches that they don't want for timber. So I was told that encourages the wildlife, because they like the coverage, the protection for the deer and the smaller critters. But it also makes a fire hazard. So I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't.
Yeah. Was it through USDA that came in, or was it through the state, or?
It's a timber management company. Yeah, it's a young man that is doing this.
Well,
So I checked him out and everything, and I liked what he was saying. So
mhm. Well, thinning is important. I don't want to contradict anything that your professional said, but I would encourage you to maybe contact your local conservation district and ask them about best practices that they might be aware of. My understanding was that some of those crowns could catch fire quickly and help fire spread, but I don't know if that's the same here as it is out west. You
I
know,
was just
and-
wondering
and
if
we
I
have different
if I should
species.
get somebody in there to take these tops and stuff off, you know, to pull
Well-
that out and cut it up for firewood.
Yeah,
you
you
know,
could
to-
do that, but you know, I would encourage you to do a little more research first, because it doesn't necessarily mean that what he said is wrong. I'm not contradicting him. I'm just saying there are different species. I'm more familiar with wildfire out west. That's where I got my doctorate, and
Well,
and
that was
that's
the whole
different
point.
species. You
Taking
know,
down dead stuff.
Yes.
That would be a
fuel,
hazard. Yes.
fuel for fire. Yeah,
Yeah.
you do want to thin them, because we're mimicking nature when we do something like that, because fire is a regular part of nature. It's regularly part of the forest cycle, and it burns, and when it burns, it does thin out the area, and then regrowth generates, and then it happens again. So when we go in and selectively prune and trim, we're mimicking fire, what fire used to do. So, you know, it sounds like you did some research, and I would do a little post-research as well.
Okay,
And if you need help with that, give me a call. I'm always happy to help with that type of thing.
okay. Great,
Thank you. Mhm.
Actually, if you leave tops and branches, it provides nutrients. If you take everything away, then you're taking a lot of the nutrients that were there in the trees away. It does looks pretty ugly for a while, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, but it disappears. I just did mine. After a while, it goes down, and causing increased fire danger depends on the kind of forest it was.
Yeah.
If it's hardwoods, maple, something like that, it's not very, very, very seldom you're gonna get a wildfire and that kind of stuff up here. If it's pine, it's more likely to have a forest fire. But it's very unlikely now, as opposed to when after the logging days, they had fires and nobody was here to put them out. They just kept going.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Ma'am, you had a question?
Oh, I'm just concerned about, are there any recommendations about diversifying the hardwoods because of the changing climate that we're gonna get?
Yeah.
It's going to be changing anyway.
they're gonna be
Right.
going north.
Yeah,
A
if
lot
I
of
can,
the species we have now will not be able to stand. We get more oaks and things like that from the south.
Mhm.
And the maples will gradually go away.
Right.
And of course, the beeches are going anyway by insects.
Yeah, we've lost the beeches and the ash in our woods, a lot of it.
might want to check with the Little Traverse Bay Band. They're planning on what's known as assisted migration.
Oh.
So they're bringing up some species from a little further south, and they're
Right.
diversifying
Yeah.
and experimenting that way.
Mhm.
Now, what I've heard from climate conferences is that one thing that is not on these models, you know, you move things north, like we're going to lose the boreal forest and birches and the spruce trees and get disease and they'll
Right.
decline and everything. So you'd think moving southern species north is the thing.
Right.
And I asked the question since it's not just that we're increasing climate, it's also the erratic temperature swings. So I asked that question, and the guy said this was at the stewardship council meeting downstate, and he said, well, we don't have any models for that. So the end thing is something that you might have come up with on your own, and that's try a lot of different things. Don't put all your one type of tree like black walnuts or something like that. Just try a lot of different things because we don't know.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question for you, but some information for you. You might want to go to DNR website for Sheboygan County.
Okay.
There's a young lady there who's very knowledgeable about forest management. As a matter of fact, she would probably have been a good person to talk to before you did the cutting on your property. But even now, she'd be a good person for a resource to answer your questions about all the scraps left behind.
So
on this tear.
to DNR in Sheboygan County.
And I
Yep.
can't remember her name, but she's very, very knowledgeable
I'll find her.
about that. So,
Thank you.
good luck.
Great. Yeah, great advice.
How receptive have the local governments in this area been to realizing that we're going through climate change and doing something positive to work around that?
Well, I sense a shift. It hasn't been a conversation that they've wanted to really engage in much in the past. But we are seeing some changes. The Watershed Council helped to facilitate some discussions with Charlevoix, Petoskey, and Harbor Springs, and Traverse City. There's a group, the Michigan Environmental Council and the Groundwork Center are both working with Traverse City to get onto 100% renewables and address emissions and that type of thing. So we have worked with them to bring them up here and have conversations with our 3 cities, and then it's now transitioned over to them taking the lead, and they followed that up by coming to Petoskey and having a community conversation, and then I think it's just next week where they're going to be back and they're going to be in Charlevoix and having a community conversation there. And so energy is at the heart of all of this, of course, but again, this publication was meant to become resilient and adapt to the changes, not to really address emissions. But we are supportive of the efforts and trying to facilitate the efforts to address emissions by the groups that work on that as a key priority. So we have, like I said, helped get those conversations started, and we're supporting them as they move forward. Yes?
Speaking of addressing emissions then, are you aware of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of the House that was recently introduced?
I heard something about it, but no, I'm not familiar with it.
Well, it's a market-based approach,
Oh.
and so there'd be a price on carbon
Mhm.
at the point of withdrawal from the earth.
Oh.
And then the dividend would be from all that fee that's pricing the carbon would be delivered back to the American people equally.
Wow.
So that really in some ways the poor and the middle class will benefit more from that, because they basically use less carbon-based products. I would encourage you to
Oh,
look it
yeah.
up. There's a website, it's called Energy Innovation, .org, I think it is. But you could just Google
Oh, yeah.
Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It
Yeah,
was
I'll look
introduced
for
in the
it.
House. It has 20-some sponsors. And periodically, I write letters to the editor about it. And so does another person in our
What carbon products are you talking about? Examples.
gas,
Okay,
oil, and coal.
okay.
Yeah. And it wouldn't necessarily, it's really a market-based solution, so it's revenue neutral. All the money, I guess you'd say taxed. It's called a fee though, because the tax doesn't go into the government coffers. It gets distributed back to the American people.
How is it distributed?
Well, right now, there's a plan for it, but right now, a lot of people get their tax refunds
Mhm.
electronically. So it probably would go that way, and then people that don't pay taxes would have to fill out an application, and that's how they would get the dividend. But the
So-
dividend would come monthly.
Okay, because I do tax returns.
Uh-huh.
And they're pretty complicated already.
bet.
So we're gonna add another layer in there.
Well, that's
So-
really worthwhile. I mean, even if that bill in its current form doesn't get passed, it gets the debate underway and
Yes.
in the places where it needs to be
Yes.
underway in a serious manner.
Yes.
Because it's just been delinquent on the part of the United States in terms of our lack of action.
Most definitely.
So,
Because there's also already a home heating credit
oh,
that can be applied for, and that's been in place for a long time
Yeah.
with lower income.
I just read this morning that carbon tax is actually beginning to be interesting to the Republicans. I was surprised to read that.
yeah, I think, as we see the storms and the tragedies unfold
Yeah.
nationwide, it's going to just be harder and harder to ignore it. I mean, most of us are of a similar age here in this room, and we remember, how it used to be and what's happening, and it's definitely different. Things are changing. We can see it. And if we can see it, others can see it as well. And I definitely am feeling a shift in my general conversations
Yeah.
with local government entities and occasionally with state and federal entities that I have to communicate to from time to time. But I personally am noticing a shift, a welcome one. Any other questions? Yeah.
Ask, so with the septic system issue, I'm just wondering if tip of the minute is to have discussions with Sledgehammer about,
We've had them here, yes, they've done a presentation, and we also work closely with the health department, and there are some situations where that is great, and other situations that it's not the silver bullet, so. But yes, we've had them here, they've done presentations to us, and like I said, we also work with the health department on these issues.
what are some of the limitations that you run into,
I don't know off the top of my head,
So the college is doing experimental stuff with treating wastewater, their sewage locally on site, and our classes have visited some of the cottages where they've been able to remediate actually a septic system that's clogged and would cost like 15, 20 grand to replace. They've been able to clean up
Yeah.
instantly.
Well, the limitations that I've heard expressed were from the health department, and there are certain situations where it just doesn't work. And I think they're mainly commercial, but I could be wrong. Okay, there's just certain, soil types and various things that the health department worries about. They're the ones that have given us there are limitations, so be careful about that, so. And we can always find out more if you need to. Let me know, and I can get the details from the health department.
Sure.
Any other questions or comments?
I was gonna ask you, what's that citizen climate law?
But the Energy Innovation and Carbon Act didn't necessarily come from the Citizens Climate Lobby, but they're certainly supporting it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time and attention. It was great to have you. Thank you.